All
Right.
right. Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Christopher. So, Christopher, we never did really a proper introduction of you and I. So, obviously, you've been a friend of mine for like 1600 years or so, ever since, at least the Napoleonic era. And that's
We've
I
been through a
say.
couple of these plagues, it seems like. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like 13 years or something, hey? It's
Yeah.
been quite a while. So anyway, why don't you just give everybody a brief intro to yourself and your greatness, and then we can dive into one of the things Christopher and I often do is we have 4 and 5 hour conversations about, everything from metaphysics to politics to technology to who knows what else in between. And so I'm excited that we're going to have some really awesome discussions first today and then, in the future. And hopefully, if you guys have some interesting stuff to discuss, let us know and we can bring you on too. And we want to build community. I think it's a great thing during this time. Get some different perspectives and learn from each other. And yeah, so fill us in about you, Christopher.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael. And yeah, no, as Michael was mentioning, him and I share a great background spanning quite a number of years and of our own personal development and seeing different things from the heights to the pits of the last recession, evolving to now. So myself, just to know a little bit of context about myself, I'm currently Vice President of Sales and Marketing, partner in a company out in Alberta, Canada, in a very traditional kind of industry. We work primarily in the sales and service of your traditional photocopiers, but expanding to many different aspects of technology. One of the things that I like to think about myself is that I try to be pretty well-rounded, understanding that on one side of things, like in business, there's very few things that doesn't intersect with the transmission of information or some degree of paper. So that kind of lets me touch a lot of different points in terms of different types of businesses and how people organize their information. Myself personally, though, I mean, very diverse. Meditation is a big thing for me. As Michael mentioned, sort of the metaphysics, the diving deep into consciousness, and one of my active pursuits on a daily level, and also organizing retreats outside of my business world types of things. And I guess through some of the business, I've also done some real estate investing over the last number of years. So own a few rental properties and diving in as much as one can to try to understand how that market works. So got my feet enough wet to get a sense of what's happening in this crazy world and in this marketplace, and trying to keep a level head amongst everything else going on. So I've always derived a ton of insight from the conversations that I have with Michael. I like to think that I know something about something until I talk to Michael about it. And then typically after that, I realize that there's many different perspectives, that there's a lot for us to share in terms of our own experiences, our own diving into insights. And one of the reasons why I've always appreciated, these what could sound long-winded conversations, but ultimately they've enriched my life over the time being. So I hope that that's some seeds for a community as well, and other great and like-minded individuals to come together, and we're just trying to figure this thing out together.
Cool. So Christopher sells himself short a little bit there. He has done an awesome job at building this company that he owns through all sorts of acquisitions. They're not just in Alberta, but they're across Western Canada. They seem to be buying a new company every time that I talk to them, which is great. Maybe we'll see what happens now in the downturn, what the opportunities bring. But when I met him, he'd been at Dell previously, so he has kind of a technology background. He ran a company called Professional Teleclasses, where he would bring on various different psychologists and people like this for professional development, which was very interesting. As you mentioned, we did stuff with real estate investing and events, a bunch of other stuff together. He launched. How long have you been doing meditation retreats for, Christopher?
Uh, Personally, I've been attending them since 2004, but I've been hosting them since 2009. So
There you go,
going 10 years.
2009. Yeah, so especially Vipassana, he was, I think the first person who successfully convinced me that I should try out mushrooms, and has gone and attended Burning Man bunch and brings just a very interesting, broad perspective to the table. So with that in mind, you were mentioning today you have some theory that we're going to see coronavirus peak at the end of April. Was that right? Or was it the end of May?
It depends on what spectrum of peaking. One of the things, thanks, Michael, that we're chatting about, just because it's such a real and active topic right now and influences so many aspects of our lives, was the question really that I was posing is what there has to be a limit to what we're experiencing. So, at what point will this limit reach its peak?
Yep.
When will we reach this eventual limit? And so led me to start looking at some of the exponentials that we're going through right now and crunching some math. So there's a little part of me like, what a
So
crazy.
let's dive in, because you made the claim that you figured that it was going to peak in the U.S. with 15 million confirmed cases, and I thought you were a little pessimistic on that. I don't think that it's gonna get that bad, at least in terms of kind of like peak. Maybe over the course of a very long period of time, we'll see that. But I think those numbers are quite high. But you said you were going to share with me some of your numbers, and
Sure.
it's funny that after you mentioned those to me, I was here with a friend, and he came and he's like, "Hey, did you see what Bill Gates posted on LinkedIn?" And Bill Gates had some different numbers, which are, more optimistic than yours. So I'm going to be excited to see your math, your explanation, and see it in comparison to what I read from his and kind of my own initial assessment. So give me your numbers. Make your
Sure.
case for me.
Yeah, for sure. I'll let you poke some holes in it. And first thing that I just want to caveat with is kind of like I said, though, I mean, personally, all of our lives are affected by this right now. And I'm not saying this without compassion, without understanding that there's a lot of suffering that's happening in the world right now. Um, but also, I just want to be real with it too. I want to kind of look at, what is our worst case? I want to kind of sort of poke that a little bit and get an understanding then for myself to try to, if anything, be prepared for what is to be expected. So with that, actually, I think 15 million is actually low for cases in the States.
We're talking about U.S. numbers, right?
Yeah. To
Yeah, yeah.
actually frame a little bit more correctly and maybe one-sided thing to it. Also throughout this, I've been
I'm going to pull up on my phone here the current numbers so that I have a little bit of context for as you're mentioning. So go ahead.
for
And
sure. And sorry, I'm not trying to stall to give you a number, but my number is actually probably going to be quite a bit larger than most people. Um, global estimates we've figured, and they're from earlier stages, but somewhere between 30 to 70% of people they figure will at some point in time be exposed and become a carrier of this virus. And those are
so,
pretty
yeah,
dramatic numbers.
those are huge numbers. What time frame is that supposed to be over? Because I guess my bias would be two things initially. The number one is Corona will probably be around as a thing for 2+ years. Like we're looking at a minimum of 12, probably realistically more like 18, 24 months if we get to a vaccine at all, right? So to vaccine time. Once you have that, the distribution of that vaccine is going to take a long time. No matter how optimistic you are, getting to the majority of the population is, a major thing. You look just at something like polio, and after years and years and years, they haven't successfully wiped out polio yet. And they've had polio vaccines for a very long time and all this kind of stuff. I mean, we're talking about some pretty, so So that's a long period over which you could get this 30 to 70%, assuming you would get there at all.
Yep.
So, you kind of were mentioning,
Let me start with
yeah, go for it.
let me start with some numbers, and then I'll let you
All
dive
right.
into that. Personally, actually, I think that we're speaking of the U.S. I think that that's going to cap out at about 100 million actual infected. I don't think that you're actually going to see nearly that number of tests. I just frankly don't think at a certain point that they're even going to bother testing at a certain point, which will have to move tracking probably more or less to inference a mortality rate from death.
And this
So,
kind of comes to a point that you and I have discussed, which I think we're in agreement with, and I think it's just perfectly rational. You were actually the one who brought it up to me, was the idea that, hey, look, the number of deaths is probably pretty accurate, at least in Western or developed countries. In India, it might be much less accurate. Sub-Saharan Africa, okay, like could be totally off, but at least in, the developed Asian countries, European, North American, or at least Canada, the US, et cetera. And so from there, we have our confirmed numbers, but then there's probably, like I would estimate, I've heard numbers 6 to 10x that of people who are somehow, they get it, but they have mild symptoms, maybe they have no symptoms at all, and, but they've got it. And so when you're saying 100 million in the US, you're talking about the total number of people who may not exhibit symptoms, who many of whom are not going to be reported, and all this kind of stuff.
actual cases, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So, and using some very basic kind of math and not sort of assuming for our appropriate flattening of the curve,
yeah,
in a trajectory of that, we'd be looking to see those numbers around the end of April, very
right,
beginning of May.
yeah.
And so part of my thing is again, I'm trying to get a level head to when are we expecting, is my earlier predicated question, when is this going to peak? Also, when are we going to start to get our lives back to normal and this kind of thing? And so, right now we're seeing a 10x increase of cases of approximately every 10 days in the United States right now. So,
But are we really, like, if I look at, and I sent you this graph earlier, I think it looks to me like the number of cases per day has been kind of flattening off. We've kind of had, and if you look, it's kind of this weird pattern. If you look at the charts, where it's like, okay, they grow kind of this exponential, then there's kind of this dive down, then a big jump, then it kind of flattens off a little bit, then a big jump, and now we're seeing it flattening off again. So are we really, like, is that, and I guess that part of my hesitation when I heard you kind of mention that number, I know you said to me, you're like, hey, look, you're not accounting for the exponential nature of it. And I think it's a really cool opportunity just to discuss exponential in general, because I think that it's something that is not very well appreciated in any field where it shows up, right? We can see, the decrease in cost of solar panels, which tend to follow kind of an exponential curve, Swanson's law, and this sort of thing. Obviously, we see Moore's law is a little bit better understood. There's a bunch of different cases where exponential math is difficult to account for. I think that it's pretty much always underestimated in stock market valuations. And so, I think that's pretty useful. But when I look here, my reference point was really to look at some of the other countries like Italy, and to see that, Italy's had it for quite a bit longer than the US has. But, although Italy is still growing by, meaningful numbers, has fallen pretty far behind relative to the US. And I kind of look at that as, like the benchmark of what we should expect. In fact, numbers of growth numbers anyway of new cases seem to have kind of flattened off over the last week or so in Italy. So
Yeah,
what?
I would agree and that's kind of the, if nothing else, to give a little bit of hope to see the countries that are starting to flatten in terms
Yeah,
of the logarithmic curve. So you're still going to see, remember if our video is going the right to left or
whatever. People can understand or they can't, and
yeah.
it's
So when we look at things from just a chart from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000, again, we see that exponential curve that we're used to seeing. When we look at that as a logarithmic curve, essentially measuring every 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, a 45-degree angle will actually show sort of in that sense what a perfect increase in terms of exponential. So the flattening of the curve on an exponential one is really kind of what they're looking at. One example that I thought was really interesting that was shared with me a long time ago, but it still it sticks and is more relevant today. And I think they use the example at this point in time of a lily pond, and they're saying, basically it doubles, every whatever it is, every day, every week, or something like that. And they're saying, okay, so it'll over 100 days or something like that is kind of when we expect it to reach its maximum. And then the question, of course, is posed, when is it at 50%? And our natural brain goes somewhere around day 49, 50, 51. But instead, an example where something grows by double every day, in this case like that, 50% would simply be day 99.
Yeah.
25% would be day 98.
Yeah, it's that. What's the expression? It's like 1 minute to midnight kind of thing there. It's like, okay, at midnight, this is going to happen. So, and it doubles leading up to there. And yeah, you don't really see it, which is kind of one of the arguments for something like global warming and climate change as well, right? Is that you're kind of approaching this point where the mechanisms take over and the change becomes almost impossible to reverse, is kind of the conventional scientific argument.
So in this case, I mean, that's the interesting thing right now is that, I can respond very clearly with a number of individuals here who say, they look around and there's maybe a couple people now sick. I think cases in the city that we're in right now, it's a much smaller city, 35,000 people over here. And I want to say officially, I think there was like one case. My girlfriend who's working as a nurse right now, I understands that there's a few more cases around in sort of areas, but let's say it maybe a maximum of 5 or 6 cases and this kind of thing like that are present in our city. Again, this is, a drop in the bucket kind of thing like that as to needing for social distancing of any kind of proactive measures, because 6 away from 35,000, I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. How many doubles does it take to get from 6 to 35,000? Now, I haven't done that math right now, but I'm curious about that. It doesn't
6 to 12 to 24 to 48 to 96 to 192 to so on and so forth. Yeah.
In this case, I mean, if we're following Canada's, roughly about every 10 days, 9 days it started with. It's actually flattened a little bit over the last cycle, but about every 10 days is 10x. So, I mean, from that, 10 days from now is 60. Okay, it still doesn't sound like a lot. 10 days from that is 600. Okay, well, now we're starting to talk about a real number with it. 10 more days, so at the end of the month, 6,000. Now we're starting to talk about, 1 in every 6 people over here. 10 more days from that, 60,000. That's more than the population of Lloydminster. So there's a cap right there, and really in terms of that logarithmic scale of where we're at right now, if it was continuing at trend, somewhere between now and 40 days you would have 100% saturation, which is not going to happen. But realistically, that's kind of the thing where they say, like, nobody's sick until everybody's sick, and that's kind of the weird thing that again is just unfathomable, even for myself to sort of put that in my head of just like, well, again, there's 6. Like, that isn't a big number. Why are they worrying about it? Yeah, today they announced that the Canadian military has actually been put on call to assist with stability and possibly of monitoring or establishing quarantine. Never in my lifetime have I ever even thought that martial law could be part and parcel to a place like a free Western democracy of Canada.
Yeah, but so never in your life did you expect Donald Trump to be president either. So, it's...
I actually ate a pot cookie, and I was get elected like the year before he did. And I was like, I started telling people, I was like, you know what, this is going to happen. Nobody believed me.
You were smarter than me. You were smarter than me. I horribly bet our mutual friend Craig Crawford that he wouldn't get elected, and obviously I lost, so that cost me a bit of money. I learned a very important investing lesson in that, actually, which was he gave me equal odds, but the book odds were not equal. So I should have hedged it and gone and, taken that money and then gone and got superior odds betting on Hillary, and I could have made the spread no matter what. So good
So now,
lessons learned. But anyway,
so now back to our first conversation about options and that
um,
kind of thing. Somewhere in there, there's some math in it.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but
So
absolutely, this is kind of the thing of current reality to what is to come, and it's not about fear mongering, but I really think it's interesting for people to sort of, it sounds weird, but wake up to a really big number and just ingrain that in your head of kind of like, okay, well, if and work it backwards, kind of thing like that. From in Canada, maybe it's 10 million people, in theory, possibly could become
so
infected.
so one of the reasons that I like this topic, and one of the reasons I think this is quite fascinating to discuss, is I do think that it's reflective of, or it's something that comes up in many, many subjects. And
Mm-hmm.
so, the truth is we're going to find out how many people actually get infected and by what dates on corona. And so to me, it's not really so much a discussion about that.
Sure.
People are going to have different projections, and we'll see. But I think what's useful is thinking about the world and the mental model that we have for what will come in the future. And I could look at this, for example, in the stock market. We could look at this with something like global warming. We could look at this with a pandemic like this, the advancement of technology. And consistently, we get it wrong, right? Like, actually, we're tremendously bad at making predictions. Ironically, the better you're an expert, typically the worse your predictions are. That's kind of some sad thing reflected by data. There's a book called Range, really good book. I don't know if you've read it, but in there they discuss how the more somebody is on TV, the less accurate their predictions are. So anyway, uh, what I notice.
This is like online, right? We're just talking like TV, right?
Well, to me, it's always a note of caution about, kind of anytime I hear somebody like, actually, if I was listening to somebody's investment advice who was highly certain about what they thought was going to happen, I would probably say that's a good person to stay away from in terms of their advice, because they probably don't have a good filter for like saying, for bringing uncertainty into what it is their assessments are, and re-examining and challenging and things like this, which is more or less what you see with a lot of the people who they make good TV, but they don't make good predictors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where I think about this is I think about like, let's look. I mean, you and I were together around the 2008 financial, like the housing crisis, that sort of thing. Obviously, there's this kind of downturn in the market today, and there's all sorts of people who are saying, "Hey, we didn't hit a bottom last week." Some people are saying we hit a bottom, whatever the situation is. But I notice that people will extrapolate the current trend. I think that's like an underlying problem, is extrapolating the current trend. And the truth is, especially when there's a negative outcome, that the trend doesn't tend to get to the worst case. And I think part of the reason is because people see that the worst case is pretty fucking brutal and they do something about it, which is part of the reason that I actually think that your numbers are going to be much more pessimistic than in reality. Is I think probably left unchecked, you'd be right. But we're not left unchecked because people are going, holy shit, this is going to be awful. And hence how they're enforcing increasingly aggressive lockdowns. I'm in Bulgaria right now, and we've been more or less not in contact with people for a few weeks now, I guess. In Serbia, nearby, they're enforcing 24-hour curfews now. Like, people can't go out for anything. I'm seeing increasing aggressiveness in terms of what they're instituting in the US and Canada. Obviously, we've seen stuff going on in Italy for quite a while now. China obviously has, done what China does. And so I think that one of the reasons is like, it's like in people's mental models, they fail to account for the fact that there will be counter reactions to what's happening. And that counter reaction really radically changes the trajectory in ways that are very difficult to predict. But the same thing like with markets, right? Like, when the market started to go down, some friends called me and they said, "Hey, what's the worst case scenario?" And I said, "Well, the worst case scenario in theory is, okay, all these people get laid off of their jobs and the businesses go under, and now there's defaults and bankruptcies, and now financial institutions are failing and assets are being sold at massive discounts, and that's further driving us into a deflationary spiral. And the government decides to institute martial law and bring in socialism, and like you can extrapolate this whole thing, but in practice it doesn't happen because they go, whoa, hang on, we don't want this to happen. Let's throw $4 trillion at the market and massively manipulate everything to the point where literally, like, what I've been telling people lately from a stock standpoint is, I'm like,
you're breaking up there, Mike.
Oh, that's no good. I don't know what to do about that. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now, Christopher?
For just
Oh, shoot. Okay, well, hopefully the fact that I am. I see.
You're all back now. I rewind. You were talking about $4 trillion at the market, and
cool. Okay, so what I was saying is that what I kind of tell people with respect to stocks and investing is that if your underlying thesis does not begin with the fact that markets are highly manipulated, then you're going to have an inaccurate worldview, because they are. Like, fundamentals have nothing at all to do with it in a space where there's government bailouts, where there is, Federal Reserve throwing, again, trillions of dollars at things. Like, this is not a world of fundamentals. This is like, in order to accurately predict what's going to happen, you have to think, okay, what will central banks do? What will governments do? And that behavior is what's going to drive the prices, not so much the underlying economics. And, there's going to be some sort of reflection. It'll, kind of work itself out there. But so if you think about it from that standpoint, what does that make you think about these numbers and the change? And are you optimistic about what we're doing and the effects that it's going to have? Do you see anything significant in terms of how we might change what's going to happen? Fill me in.
No, really good question. So backing up a little bit, as we're moving from sort of I like the concept of countermeasures. And so as we started with some of this about our recent talk of coronavirus here, one of the interesting things too that I recognized, again, where do we see the examples of successful mitigation of the current worldwide pandemic? So we saw China, like we saw really interesting, highly militaristic. They would lock people inside their houses, that they'd sort of
sort of welding doors shut on people. Like,
Now that being said, though, they locked down a province of like 40 million people. For us, more than the size of Canada, kind of thing like that. However, they kept supply chains. They kept them fed. They kept supplies coming to them. They made sure that if they needed medical supplies, that they came out. In a weird sort of way, I don't personally necessarily agree with that, but in a weird sort of way, they managed to maintain order in their authoritarian style that they were able to do there, which was a very, in that case, draconian but an effective countermeasure. Now it's interesting because, again, I have
just to inject a quick side question there. Do you believe their numbers? Do you there's a lot of talk, obviously, that China manipulates their numbers, that they're lying about stuff. There's kind of some of the most interesting piece of data that a bunch of people have asked me about, and I have no idea how to respond to, is that the mobile subscribers for the major mobile networks have declined by like a few million people. And any thoughts on that?
That's super fascinating. Like any economist has understood, it's amazing for a GDP that size to do 6.0% global increase in GDP year after year after year. Not 5.8, not 6.2, but 6%. So there's a constant thread. And again, in kind of fairness to China, with a central state, if I want to increase by 6%, I just increase by 6%. It doesn't matter if anybody's doing anything productive or whatever and stuff like that. I just command a factory to, I don't know, make more widgets.
Produce stuff, and
but there is a certain command state economy there that you can kind of control things, and the state is known to be extremely oppressive And actually, there was a lot of accolades when they first came out. Although the very, very first thing was that they smothered the doctors, and they put a clamp down on, I think, 14 different doctors over there who tried to announce that this thing was a major issue. One of the doctors was arrested. He died of the virus a little bit later on. That
I
was
heard
pretty
that.
cool.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's classic China. That's kind of so, right
It's
now.
it's kind of sad that we laugh about it that way. Hey, like it's classic China. They're just killing people. No big deal.
It's a weird place over. So now the crazy thing about China is that they're very much branding their response and communism to how effective they were. Like
Mhm.
that's actually being created as a national brand for them to say trust the authoritarians, because look at us, we were the only country in the world able to mitigate this issue. So
Maybe they should go next door to Taiwan and see that those guys did it even better. But anyway,
well, and then that's the neat thing. So there are social democracies, South Korea, Taiwan. No, we're
Singapore, Hong
all
Kong.
a little weirded out by what's happening in Japan right now, where they had there was a recent report as frequent or as recent as last week that everyone's going out to massive bars, stadiums, events, and stuff like that. They only imposed a 1 weekend lockdown, and so people were also suspicious that some of those numbers were either artificially low or that they're about to explode and they're going to be the next Italy kind of thing like that because they're aging population and stuff like that. I digress a little bit. There are social democracies that through testing and active pursuit over who the individuals were, that there was a social strategy that was being able to put to a little bit of detective work to being, you contacted these people, you're on this plane, let's
It
lock
was
it down.
crazy, like what they're able to. I'm obviously a big fan of Singapore, just in general as a country. I don't know. Have you been to Singapore yet?
Not yet, no.
Oh, you
If
got to
it's
go to
I'm
Singapore.
going to go check it out.
Yeah, no. Singapore is like one of the most impressive countries in the world for sure. And I actually really appreciate the government in a lot of different regards and their policies. But I mean, I was hearing stories that they have a very sophisticated CCTV system throughout, and of course they can do this because it's one city country. But apparently, they would identify everybody who'd got the virus, and then they would follow them around on the CCTVs, looking at everyone they'd been in contact with. Then they would use that to be able to go back and then test all those people and quarantine people and all this kind of stuff. Like, I mean,
Yep.
it's far too late to do that in a place like the US, Canada, most of Europe, etc. But even if you weren't too late, it would simply be impossible to do it because somebody jumps in their car and drives to Alabama, and who knows where all they stop on the way and who they talk to, and they're in New
Track your cell
Orleans.
phone. That's what some of the other ones are doing too. Is that your Google location history? I had my car stolen once, and I watched it drive around the city, and
I remember that. I remember that. Yeah.
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 So there are technology ways for doing that. So I think that there are some positive things that we're seeing in terms of areas of mitigation and areas where certain things have been successful. But this is where, kind of stemming back to some of my earlier numbers, though, where I genuinely believe America, land of the free, Canada, very much the same, and that kind of thing like that. Where here, having traveled to Asia and examining it, cross culture or what the differences
Yeah.
are. In Japan, it's very common to wear a face mask if you're sick because you don't want to get other people sick.
Yep.
Here, and I've heard it. I mean, it's a comment. Oh my God, that person wearing a face mask and
Yeah.
pre-corona and stuff like that because they're afraid of being near that person getting sick. And there's very individualistic
Yeah.
kind of natural response to like, I don't want to associate myself with that. Oh my God, did you hear so sick or whatever and stuff like that, as opposed to, almost that I don't know, over romanticize it or whatever, but a bit of a
Yeah.
sense of honor and collective sense that we're trying to do it for the whole,
Yeah.
which is what I
It's
saw.
definitely more collectivistic culture. And I mean, even too, like I heard, I have some friends who live down in Thailand and really love it. And they were commenting like, they don't shake hands there. That's not, you have this like little bow thing
Yep.
that takes place. Uh, and same thing, you go to Japan, people bow, etc. And that lack of physical contact helps to reduce the spread. And that's just a cultural piece, as opposed to, I'm here with my friend from Greece, and they have a very
And maybe a
physical
bidet
culture.
system as well too, and no runs on toilet paper. But anyways,
which actually is something we should be
a few little
emulating in
things.
the West for sure.
Yeah,
So yeah. So anyway, continue.
absolutely.
I was kind of interrupting you there, but so you were saying regarding the spread and the culture and how it makes a difference.
So yeah, so I think those things are genuinely, they can affect the curve, of what it is that we're seeking to achieve. And I think that there's enough individuals here where, the question for me, when this first started coming out, I kind of realized fairly early that there was just listening to WHO, it wasn't like I had sleuthed it together or whatever, but was simply the fact that they had gone past trying to contain it, and now we're trying to mitigate losses.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
so
I remember you were kind of the first person who commented to me on that, about how it's like the idea is not to contain it, but just to flatten the curve, to spread it out over time. And
yeah, and like I said, that was kind of health scientists. But again, I just don't think most of my friends or the people that I was around really accepted what they were saying. Like
yeah,
that was our leading health experts who were, they're the scientists who figure that
yeah.
stuff out. I'm the guy who was like, oh, I read it and actually believed them. I don't know. But it's kind of funny though to think about, and then once you change that perspective though, everything kind of changes. Like I've kind of accepted the fact that at some point in time I'm probably going to get it. My girlfriend's a nurse. She's highly, exposed to this kind of thing like that. I'm very whatever, and that kind of thing like that. I'm with this person. I'm in a very high risk area of getting it, rather than, again, this sort of hex, sort of pretend like it's not going to happen. It's not around me, and this kind of thing like that. So again, once we kind of move a little bit into that acceptance phase, okay, well, how in my behaviors am I a good steward of not trying to, not being around people that could be vulnerable, limiting my social exposure in both my workplace or in other people that I might be affecting, and this kind of thing like that. So, I mean, the hope is, I think, if we can show people some big numbers to a certain degree, I don't actually know if it will reduce. I plus or minus, I still think maybe 100 million people in the States will probably end up with this thing. Until it's either herd immunity, which means that you've got like 70 or 60 to 80% of people that have gone through it and now can't get it
at least 50, I was told. Yeah, at least 50 is where it starts.
High numbers. I mean, we're talking like 170 million people and that kind of thing like that for it to get to that stage. We know that a vaccine's at the very least a year away, and that's going to be for first responders, and then it's probably going to be another 6 months to a year or so before that evens out. So again, it's just like you have this highly transmittable thing. It's going to be spreading out across, and we're still shocked by these numbers every single day. So I want to bring it back to what you were saying about the logarithmic side of things, but it's just such a pertinent example where it is. People are just like, oh my God, have you seen World Meter again today and stuff like that? And the next big number, it's 700,000 today. It will be 7 million, 70 million. Once we start to round around, possibly around the billion number and stuff like that, we're probably not done in terms of this thing. So it's like, shock yourself with the big numbers first.
But wouldn't somebody have, like, it's funny, I was reading something, what was it? I think it was from Sean Hannity's show. Trump was on there and did an interview with him, and they were giving the numbers of H1N1. And, it infected a lot of people. And couldn't you have made kind of the same argument about H1N1? And it didn't get to, I mean, I don't know, I think 60,000 Americans or something were killed by it. But certainly not, 200 million or something like that, people getting it. So couldn't you have made kind of a similar argument for that? And it turned out that, okay, it affected a lot of people, but not, I guess it's this thing that people like to extrapolate trajectories of things, including exponential curves. And in reality, exponential curves, I feel like there's this difference between the academics on that and the reality on that, because really things tend to go more like S curves than they do like, exponential curves. And I mean, they have to do this because you hit some limit on growth, right? That's, invariable. Usually we flatten it out before that for whatever reason. And again, like I kind of come back to the question of Italy. Now, an interesting thing, I saw an interview with Bill Gates the other day, and he was talking about just this simple math. And I'd gotten this from, I don't know if you remember back in the day, you and I had some stuff with CEO Space. And around then, we'd hired Scott DeGraffenreid, who was a viral marketing expert. And he was just kind of explaining some of the stuff around viral growth, right? and how you have viral coefficients, and viral coefficient is super important. And if you have a viral coefficient over 1, doesn't really matter what the number is, so long as it's over 1, you get this tremendous explosion in numbers.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter whether it's, here I think we're talking about 2.5 or something like that. One person infects 2.5 people, which is in itself kind of interesting to me, because I'm like, what? In 2 weeks, you only infected 2.5 people? I thought this is supposed to be highly contagious. I don't know, what are you doing with this? But anyway, but as soon as you
not like a pyramid, Michael.
yeah. I mean, this is like the most successful MLM in history. I don't know. It's but the interesting thing is, as soon as you reverse those numbers, and as soon as you go below 1, it very quickly kills itself off, right? And so, the numbers Bill Gates used were 4 versus 0.4. And it's like, if you just extrapolate out a viral coefficient of 0.4, well, then, the numbers level off pretty quickly. And it's almost like what we see with the Italian numbers. Yeah, they're still taking time to play out, but that the curve has flattened a lot. And, if we, I guess Trump extended I don't know what you want to call it, the lockdown in the US to the end of April now. And so doesn't it flatten itself out sufficiently in that time that it kind of burns itself out?
The issue with that, though, is that so far, until we have a vaccine, or hopefully it doesn't mutate towards, I think there's 2 different strains of it right now, but much more than what it is, so it reinfects people. But provided that those horrible bad things don't happen, or more, the thing about it too is global interconnectedness. If you solve it in one country,
that is a concern. That is definitely a concern.
But that's exactly it. So Italy caps itself out right now. How long are their borders capped away from every other country around them? Countries like India, there's a lot of the developing world right now, which that's where I really feel for, where it's crazy. And we're never going to see reports of that. We're never going to see the daily tick and some of the center places in India or Bangladesh or really, really, developing world countries that just don't have the metrics for that kind of thing. And that won't necessarily, we won't see that as a worldometer kind of thing like that exploding and stuff like that, but it'll be continuing like that. It's a long burn. And so what happens if all the developing worlds, countries in the developing world really effectively sort of pitted on lockdown and things like that, this thing goes like fire throughout the developing world. It took a handful of cases for it to come from China and spread in a few different places for it to hit the rest of the world. We have an interconnected world. That's where it comes back to what I was saying earlier, where it's like, there's got to be a maximum total, but at the same time, when we kind of look at that's really where, Pandora's box is open, and the world experts kind of look at that. And that was the real big shift. We had an opportunity at the very beginning to contain it.
Yeah.
It's draconian and it's hardcore. And if you do it right, you can eliminate those things from spreading and existing. Right now, we're so far well past that, and in an interconnected world, we can't shut down every connection. I mean, there's issues right now where Spain was saying they're having troubles picking all the fruit and strawberries and all these things like that, because typically they'd have immigrants from different parts of the EU come over and pick the fruit and stuff like that. There's still travel and there's still connection in between it, and so. Yeah. It's for me, I think that's kind of the really big thing that's maybe being missed right now. Fauci was
and I think that that's a very interesting point, and that's where I was talking about timelines, because I think that it's pessimistic or optimistic, depending on if you want to take the view that it's better to get it over with quick. To believe that we'll be at 15 million in the US by the end of April. Could that happen and by the way, that's confirmed cases. So, my basic assumption is that we have, 6 to 10 times more people than that who actually get it. So, could we get to that many confirmed cases over time? Probably. Will it be that quickly? I'm pretty skeptical. And again, that's kind of looking at what's happened in Italy, how they've kind of slowed it. Like you said, I think there's a strong, and it's kind of a concerning argument, which maybe brings us into a next topic, which is, what do you see as the longer lasting impact of all this? Like, does that mean that we're going to have travel shut down? I'm somebody who travels. I've been to 33 countries in the last 2 years. I love to travel all over the place. Am I not going to be able to do that for the next 2 years because they're going to have some sort of restrictions? Are they going to, I don't know, do some sort of a weird test for me to be certified that I can go? I think somebody was throwing around a suggestion that you should have a database of people who've been certified that they've got it and they're immune now. So, we can allow them travel and somebody else we can't. What do you see as some of the outcomes of this?
That's I think what I was really trying to get to in my own soul searching of looking at these numbers of this thing spreading, of kind of what is the new reality of things. There's this Donald Trump very clearly, I want to just get the economy back to it. Everybody wants to get back to work and doing things, business as usual. And looking at, again, that as a reality, it's either kind of getting it and getting through it, and this is kind of one of the things. It's such a weird, the reason why it spread so fast is because it's kind of, benign's the wrong word, but because it's only, and it's the very least mortality rates that we have, I think, in Germany or South Korea and stuff like that, around 0.5 or something, like marginally more than it's still higher than the flu, 0.1 to 0.5. It's about 4 or 5 times as deadly, but still almost manageable. And then spreading all the way up to, your 10% and stuff with
Italy is crazy and stuff. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So, what does that look like as a reality? And you're right. I mean, the big question is do we have a society that can kind of live with that, like chickenpox or like, certain illnesses, that we've gotten them and personally we've been able to get through them. That's kind of one possibility to it. I see that there's going to be a heavy, that's why I'm saying at the end of the April, at the beginning of May and that kind of thing like that, really, that's where we're hitting heavy. That's where I think Western culture is really going to feel this one. Where right now, everyone kind of says that they feel it, but they're at home and they're on TikTok and they're having a great time. And this kind of stuff. I think
you got all the home workouts going on Instagram.
I think around that time is when you're going to have as I said, nobody's sick until everybody's sick. And then I think that's when people are going to be like, oh, everybody's kind of got this. And to different degrees, some people go through it and almost asymptomatic. There's that smaller percentage, it's that 10%, really heavy issues with some of the underlying conditions.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, most people have looked at this. The experts are doing what they should, which is kind of looking at it almost like statistics, and then people are people. We experience what we do, but the statisticians say, if you've got an underlying condition, I mean, heck, one of the big concerns is things like diabetes. There's 49 million diabetics in the United States right now, and that's a 7% mortality. When we look at that, so there's these high.
Again, I would caution that 7% of the confirmed cases, and the confirmed cases is probably, so anytime I see the mortality rates, I optimistically kind of pull them down a bit because of the fact that I believe there's a lot of cases that don't get reported. And so, and if you see 7%, it's really maybe 2% or something like that, which is still a high percentage when you're talking about a very large number of people. I mean, 2% of 49 million people is still almost a million people, right? So.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Michael, because if we're saying our underlying assumption is maybe 5x of the cases and that kind of thing like that are reported, you divide mortality by 5x. It's still, like I said, it's still going to impact people. It's still going to be something that's
a huge number. Huge number, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, again, I'm an optimist, and I look forward at this where I'm like, okay, we are coming up with treatments. They just, the FDA authorized this, whatever the heck it is, hydrochloro HQC or HQ, whatever the heck it is, thing. And from what I've been hearing from doctor friends, et cetera, there's some good signs that it's pretty effective. So I do think that we're going to get that mortality rate down quite a bit over time, purely because of the fact that, you have a lot of people working on getting the mortality rate, and thankfully we have a lot of ingenuity and a lot of great insights, and we've got Donald Trump, who knows more about viruses than anyone, and so it's um, it's good that, but yeah, I am a little bit optimistic that the mortality rates are going to be much lower as we start to get out further and further on the timeline, right? Like, of course, if you're on the front line, that's a bit of an issue, but by 12 months in, we'll have available medicine, we'll have great treatment protocols, we'll have more access to ventilators because they'll produce a whole bunch more of them. We'll have figured things out. Again, I don't think it's going to help so much, unfortunately, for the third world countries, which is going to be potentially pretty catastrophic for some of them. Hopefully the warm weather in Africa helps to mitigate that. And I don't think they have a big diabetes problem there, but they've got other problems, HIV positive. You've got people with lung issues from smoke inhalation, things like this, from things being burning, and so yeah, that's gonna be.
So I think, yeah, leading from the morbid side of that too, I agree. I think that the ingenuity of people is going to greatly reduce the impact, and there's going to be interesting measures. Like, again, as I mentioned before about the potentials of what sounds like martial law, but I don't think it'll be that extreme. In fact, I would welcome armed forces here. I'm sure would be here to help people get groceries and maintain social order and stuff like that. I don't think that they're here to lock people in necessarily, kicking and screaming into their houses.
You don't think they're going to give you an implant that may track the fact that you've had this disease and monitor your situation, make sure you don't go into contact with somebody else who might be infected and possibly have the number 666 tattooed on it or something? And
I'm just looking for the bionic. I browse Reddit while I'm looking at somebody in the eye, and they think that I'm deeply focused on their conversation or something like that. that's all that I'm in it for. But no, I don't think that it's going to go towards that extreme. I do believe in our our maintenance of social order. But I do think, back to that other thing though, is I just dramatically think that the general population underestimates. That was back to your earlier point about exponentials, and I would challenge even the optimist Michael that there's maybe an underestimation of both how long
it's possible,
and what kind of impact this looks like. And so, for myself, I'm as a business owner, I'm super excited about getting back. I'm loving opportunities that I'm trying to work on, selling video conferencing technologies and helping be a part of the solution. And, I really want to change, even our focus about how do we make sure that we're taking care of our customers and doing the right thing for people as a whole, for our communities. I'm weary though. I'm weary that there is going to be a long-lasting fundamental change. I hope that there isn't. I hope that it's like swine flu or something like that goes over. But immediately you can tell that this isn't swine flu. Already we're in the number of days and that kind of thing. Swine flu was over the course of about 2 years or so, and I think you're right, about 600,000 deaths globally attributed, somewhere between 3 and 600,000, I think was when I read some numbers about it, that kind of thing like that. We're expected to see that maybe within about 20 days or so. Again, following the curves over there. So we'll have to see kind of what happens there. But how do we wrap our minds around that there is something that is there without too much panic about the crises of what things change, and how do we address ourselves into things of being a part of our solution and as a community as a whole. One thing that I'd be really interested actually, and Michael, I know you've been working on an app, which is kind of interesting. One of the ideas that I had was, how do you even bridge community together to to actively work on solutions? So, you're, and especially if this prolongs, maybe this all brushes over, that'd be super cool. I am the optimist that would love to see that happen. But if it was the case that we're in this for, let's say, 6 months even and stuff like that, you're going to have grappling issues of, seniors, of people that can't leave their houses and stuff like that, and trying to connect even with volunteer communities of people who make, I don't know, bread, people who can take care of other people and stuff like that, do tasks or help other people out around sort of on things that might need to be done. I think that might be a really great opportunity of kind of like the Uber for social benevolence or something like that, where it's like
That's
connecting people
interesting.
with where they want to go. I think that it's a ripe opportunity for such a community tool to be present.
Hmm.
I'm not a developer, but I jump on that in a heartbeat if I'm just driving a meal over, or if I'm taking care of somebody that I know that would be in need. I would support it fully. I just think that that would be something that would be also a game changer in terms of helping people if they're taken care of. It's easier for people to socially or
Yeah, it's
dis-
super interesting idea. Throw some money at some developers to go and build something like that starting tomorrow, so that you can get it out there. That's interesting. Yeah, like I look at it. I think there's two, maybe three sides. So first of all, of course, I'm interested in projecting forward and trying to figure out, okay, like what are the consequences? Uh, Second, of course, is what are the opportunities that brings? There's going to be a lot of people who are badly hit in terms of, like, I just think about service workers. Obviously, in some parts of the world, they've done some things for interest payments. They've gone and looks like giving out some free money to people, things like this. I don't know how long you can continue that for. Jobless claims have obviously jumped dramatically, although in talking to a lot of friends who are business owners, I think those numbers are somewhat artificially inflated because of the fact that the attitude of those business owners is, all right, we were going to lay you off so that you can qualify for unemployment, and we intend to bring you back as soon as things clear over. So hopefully that doesn't mean permanent job loss. It's kind of a temporary, short-lived thing, kind of almost like a seasonal effect. But then the other thing that I look at is even is kind of this psychological piece, and how people are going to deal with it, and whether that's going to be at odds with government policy. And I might have mentioned to you before, there's a really interesting phenomenon. They discuss it in the Malcolm Gladwell book, David and Goliath, which is what they call the near miss phenomenon. So I don't know, are you familiar with this?
not in depthly, no.
Okay, so basically what they talk about is the situation in London around World War II, when the Nazis were going to bomb London. And they had thought of building bunkers underneath the city, but had decided, you know what, we shouldn't do that because we're afraid that people will just never come out of the bunkers. They're going to just cower in there in fear, and we're going to have a problem. They thought there would be a mass exodus of people out of the city, and London would basically become a ghost town. And it turned out pretty much the opposite happened. That actually, within a very short period of time, the British spirit was raised. People were like rallied together, and they were pretty indifferent to the fact that they were being bombed. They weren't even looking up anymore. And they attribute it psychologically to this phenomenon called near miss, which is that when the city gets bombed, there's three groups of people loosely who are affected. So the first are those who die. That's the most serious. But those people are dead. So those people, don't continue to project their feelings of fear or whatever onto the city. Then there are those who are, maybe caught in a blast and severely hurt, and maybe traumatized for life. But they're a fairly minority group of people. The majority of people are ones who, wow, the house across the street blew up, but I was fine, and it kind of desensitizes them and creates this feeling almost of invincibility, that people are able to go forward and kind of carry on with life. And I have a feeling that we're going to see something quite similar with this, that, you kind of mentioned how you felt like the Fed and the central governments, et cetera, were maybe premature in bringing the nuclear arsenal of tools to the market and the economy to try and stimulate things. And in a sense, that may have catalyzed additional panic, actually. But certainly we have a lot of kind of this overwhelming fear. You see people who are, believe, okay, look, there's ushering in a one world government, and this is, the end of democracy. and we better run for the hills and lock things up. And, other people think, okay, we're going to die or whatever. And that is most likely overstated. That's kind of an emotional response to what's going on. And the result of that is that when it doesn't have that happen, when it kind of blows over and you see that, yeah, some people got it, a few people here and there died, but I wasn't really that affected. Maybe I had mild symptoms, maybe whatever, that's going to catalyze a psychological effect where people are not so bothered by it anymore. And they're ready to move on and just kind of live with it as a new normal. There's been some talk that we'll see. I think maybe it was you who was mentioning this idea of, okay, what we'll probably see is, a next wave and so on. And we may have, a COVID-19 season for at least a period of time that it will come back. We don't know, like we said, how weather seasonality is going to affect it, but people would kind of deal with it. Now, my concern there is that government regulation, being what government regulation is, they may not be so willing to move on with it. And that's where I come back to kind of this idea of travel, right? Of, are you going to have very restricted travel? Does it suddenly mean that countries that formerly didn't have visa requirements now have visa requirements, where part of it is you need to get a medical test of some sort that states that you're good and you're not going to be a carrier of this disease? Or, I don't know, maybe you've got some sort of a prophylactic like you get for malaria to, say, okay, you're going to start taking this 2 weeks before you travel so that, you can say, yeah, I'm on this and I'm good. And, I've got some sort of vaccine record. Like,
customs?
What was that?
I said, you don't wear a condom through customs? I don't know.
Of course, doesn't everybody?
Michael.
Yeah, so like, and actually, like, I think there is this legitimate question of, is the government response, the treatment worse than the disease sort of thing, right? And we're going to see what the actual treatment is, but what do you see that that's likely? Do you think that now that's too extreme as a response and they're kind of going to go back to a more normal state of operations? Or I think like, to your point about the other countries getting it, I think I was one of the people who had mentioned, I said, in theory, you want to be the last country to go on lockdown because you're going to be the least time in lockdown, because everybody else needs to stay in lockdown until the last one has cycled through this whole thing. And so, like, what, how do you see governments responding to that?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really interesting one. And back to some of your early comments about, I think a lot about the market, just being involved in business, and so many, like, we're all affected by the economy. So, I mean, it's something that's whole for each individual going through this. And, to say that the efficient market, the market without intervention or whatever, that markets will program themselves is I think naively, I kind of believe that a little bit when I studied some economics earlier, but I don't believe it at all now, watching, different cycles of from recessions to, where bailouts happen and where money gets pointed and this kind of thing. So I think that there's going to be, and I mentioned this kind of early on too, when we were immediately affected, by, in Canada, we had some forced shutdowns of certain industries if they weren't deemed essential services.
Mm-hmm.
And again, my look at that is, if that's caused by the government and their regulations, at least probably good government practice without being lynched at the next election cycle is actually supporting those businesses and making sure that if they're the ones sort of asking for it, then they would be the ones to help support it. I think that, there's a couple different levels in terms of the response to it. One is, like I mentioned before, about militarization and the actual enforcement in terms of quarantine. I think that's really going to shake up some people. I don't think that most people in Western world countries are used to that involvement. That's a lot more prevalent in different parts of the world and this kind of thing.
To your point, I think there's actually an underlying fear, particularly in the US, to that, because that really is kind of contrary to what the whole, Revolutionary War was about, right? It was like, hey, look, we're not going to have these guys coming and forcing this stuff on us. And so, although to be fair, like, when I was looking at kind of economic projections, to me, the most similar situation to this that I could find throughout history, and there's obviously a ton of differences, but most similar situation was World War I and World War II. I mean, in World War II, they basically took everybody's resources. They had rationing of resources. They took all kinds of people out of the economy and sent them overseas to literally just destroy wealth, like actually destroy things. And here we're talking about the destruction of a lot of human life, potentially. And so, yeah, like it's definitely, again, it might be more palatable in some parts of the world, but certainly less.
And sort of cut you off. One thing that I was thinking about our conversation today, and something that I wanted to ask you is maybe speaking of exponential, speaking of just even government debt. What is the capacity of both government and corporate debt without us being, there is a certain number where that government debt and those interest rates and a mixture between the two starts to weigh down the whole lever of society. There is magic numbers that don't work anymore to create so much debt. I was reading a little bit more before, like they were thinking that Canada could probably support, I think it was, what do we have? We have a $2 trillion economy. I think we've got what is our deficit right now? Wow, it's ballooning by the second, but it was 600 billion. Now it'll be close to probably $1 trillion or so. They were saying that, I think, sorry, the numbers that I had in my head, the US economy, they were suggesting that it could probably support a debt of about 50 trillion before the weight of the debt would start to now we'd be just paying off debt for the rest of our time, kind of thing like that. So we divide everything by. So
I mean, I'd love to do a whole session on that subject, because I think that plays a lot into certain theories of economics that are quite misunderstood. So that's a whole other thing, and it is a really interesting question, right? It's like, okay, how far can you go down this line? Like, I think that there was probably a lot of people who, back when the U.S. had $5 trillion of debt, thought that the 22 trillion or so of debt that there was prior to this, crisis, and now throwing out trillions more, it's going to be. I've kind of openly said, we're talking about doubling the national debt over the course of 5 years. I think, like, we're going to have declining tax revenues, and we're going to have massive increase of spending. There's going to be a $5 trillion deficit this year. Like, that's basically pretty inevitable, I think. And the debt has been doubling about every 10 years. So, we're just talking about accelerating that pretty aggressively at this point in time. And it's an interesting question. Like, how far down can you go? I would be, in a sense, more concerned about the corporate debt than the government, or at least the central government debt. Municipal and provincial or state is a little bit more like corporate. But I think it is an interesting question. The thing about central government debt in a country that can print their own money is, in theory, they can just print as much money as they want to pay off that debt. And so they're really not
quantitative easing, or they can print as much money.
No, in theory, they can print money. Like, they don't do that right now. The way that they do it is they issue bonds, and but they don't. In theory, they're not required to do that. In theory, they have the power to just simply print money to pay off the debt, so long as the debt is denominated in their own currency, which I was doing some research on it. So the U.S. is entirely in their own currency. Most of Europe is 99, or at least of the Euro bloc. So there's 28 EU member states. 14 of them are members of the Eurozone, and almost all of those are 99+% denominated in euros. So you can more or less do that in Europe. There's a few countries that do not have in their own currency, like Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, a few of these. Again, it's usually in euros, so there's something that is a little bit mitigatable there. I would be a bit concerned for countries that don't have that or that have foreign debt. That's an issue, but we haven't really seen that either. We haven't seen a situation where we say, okay, let's try and just print a bunch of money to get rid of our debt. The other thing you can do
is seen that in a few hyperinflation examples, but
But the
I think,
different but the
yeah,
difference in those cases was, so the hyperinflation examples, that was foreign denominated debt. This is a very, very different thing, because in those cases, the more you print, the less your money is worth relative to the debt. So you have to print more, and it becomes this very rapid growing deflation of your money. If the debt is denominated in the same currency as you're printing, then it's an exact number that you have to print. In the US, they print exactly whatever it is, currently 22, 23 trillion dollars, and that's it, you're done. So you don't have to worry about, hey, we don't have to print 200 trillion in order to pay off 20 trillion in debt, which they would have to do in Zimbabwe, they had to do in the Weimar Republic, where you had your debt denominated French French francs and things like this. Like, if you go through and you look at that, there's some fundamentally different economics there at play. I mean, the other thing is you could default on the debt, right? Like, there isn't necessarily a requirement to pay that, especially like if you look, so the US, I think it's something like 39% of the US debt right now is held by the Federal Reserve, which is basically paid to themselves, right? Because the profit of the Federal Reserve gets paid back to the Department of Treasury, mostly, not entirely. In Japan, the Bank of Japan holds like over 50% of the Japanese national debt now. And so it's this kind of bizarre, artificial, weird construct whereby, okay, it would be bad for China and it would erode confidence in the US system, the US ability to raise debt, if they said, hey, we're going to default on it, or even maybe if they devalued their currency a bunch in order to pay it off. But, on the flip side, how far can you push that along? I mean, and what are the consequences at that stage? Some people talk about kind of the everything bubble, and they talk about all this coming down. And, if you look at there was a really interesting thing, a really good friend of mine, who's a very skilled trader and hedge fund manager. He had showed me a couple of years ago the future expected returns of the S&P 500, the Dow, and over the future expected returns over 10 years was about negative 40-some%, like an insane decrease in your investment returns. Right now, that's one particular view. Most of them put it around zero, right? 0% future expected return over 10 years, just due to the high valuation and low interest rates. And saying, hey, look, over time, as interest rates are going to go up, that's going to counterbalance this, and it's going to weigh down on your returns. But on the other hand, the Bank of Japan, and I mean Japanese in general, have had close to zero interest rates since 1990, basically, right? So they've gone for 30 years without needing to raise it. Back in the day, I remember in around 2009, when interest rates fell to very close to zero, I was thinking, like, we're locking. I mean, you and I were talking. It's like, lock in those mortgage rates because it's got to go up. But actually, does it have to go up? Apparently, there's a strong argument that it doesn't have to. And, between quantitative easing and between all these different policies, it's very difficult for them to raise it. It's highly likely that you keep it down. And even if you wanted to, like, these policies are incompatible with each other. So it's
yeah. So interesting. I mean, there's a lot of strings to pull at over there in terms of that one. I think you're right. That probably has to be a whole other almost podcast and that kind of thing. But I do think that there are a couple areas where I'm just, if that was the case, if someone can print as much as their own denomination, is that an option for a place like China, who, is sort of creating their own? My understanding, is that there's a balance amongst things. You have to create your own economy. You have to create this sort of self-sustaining bubble. You have to have enough consumer confidence in it, where you're feeding goods and services to your own consumers. That has to be blended with, again, purchase parity of other things. People do want to travel. They want to be worldly. They want to make sure that they can get goods and services from other countries. So, by a country like China going ahead to print a lot more of theirs, where maybe they're less dependent and this kind of thing like that on some of the other countries, they're actually more dependent on sort of the influx of certain goods and services from the United States, where that becomes if their dollar is set too high, they can't. purchase parity is now eroded for them to get semiconductors, materials, and things like that of an outside interdependent kind of economy that they're looking for. So I just, there's a whole bunch of those we'd have to take care of. I think each one of those a little bit more systemically to kind of look at certain areas to it, in terms of how much could be printed. But I think
Well, and I think the thing, again, let's do another whole session on this, because I think it's a really interesting subject and there's lots of consequences to it, and I don't think it's very well understood. So I think it's something we can dive into. But just before we move on that, I think part of the thing at work here that allows it to be more sustainable than people project is the fact that everybody's doing it. It would be one thing if you were the only country that was doing it, but like everybody's doing it. So it's like, hey, we're all running towards a cliff, but we're all running towards the cliff together, So it's like, it's not like everybody's like, okay, bye. Like, oh, he went off the cliff. It's like, no. Well, let's see if I can keep ahead of the other guy here. It's
100%. I think that's exactly it. That was sort of in my thinking as well about how governments could do this. If there's an orchestrated, and I think after 2008 there was an orchestrated global. They didn't quite just print their way out of it. A lot more quantitative easing, but there was a concerted effort in each one of them to maintain liquidity, to increase, deficit spending in Canada, deficit spending in US, deficit spending in Japan, deficit spending in euros, and this kind of thing like that. And each one of them were trying to inflate together around the same place, which I believe, and again, there's probably some more math that you'd be better at showing, but I think that a lot of this last stock market, I don't think there's a part of me that doesn't really feel like we fully even corrected from 2008, 2009. I felt like it was a general.
It makes me think about something with Bitcoin. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he's like, "Hey, look, if you assume the markets are mean reversing, if you look, like Bitcoin has never fallen below the 200-day moving average. Like, it's stayed very high on this historic basis. It's going up, going up, going up, and you haven't seen this pullback that really, if you look back a few years ago, we're talking about a few dollars, and
Yeah.
you're like, hey, really, if you want to like pull back to the mean, we should have this drop. I don't know what it would be. Let's say $100 or something, right? Like this massive crash in prices, and that hasn't happened. And yeah, like, I mean, even looking, if we talk about the stock market today, and I mean, so the stock market's again up a little bit today, around 22,000 or whatever, in the Dow Jones. And it's like, well, again, like the argument that I would come to people, and I think you were kind of advocating the idea that towards the end of April, we'll see another big pullback. We're kind of in a bit of a bull trap right now, where we're seeing this bounce back, but the bounce back is, maybe not sustained. And it's super hard to say, I think, because the market is so manipulated, it's hard to make a rational evaluation of that. But you look at it and it's like, okay, well, the market is not that much below what it was in December 2018. And if I look at the economic outlook in December 2018 compared to today, it's way worse today. Like it's incomprehensibly different. Like, so how could the market possibly be priced the same? And the truth is, the price is not rational because it's so stimulated, right? It's, like we said, I mean, they basically in the last couple of weeks have thrown $4.5 trillion at it, with the option to throw many, many more trillions at it. They've announced QE infinity. And so, they're basically saying, hey, look, no matter what it costs, we're going to make sure this bad boy doesn't go down. And we're just going to make up fake money to keep stimulating it so your pension funds don't go down and our hedge fund buddies don't lose out, and, so on and so forth.
So the unsophisticated, one of my first analyses was, around the end of April, provided that there's no external massive stimulus, outside investments, this kind of thing like that, when people jump trillions into things like that, that's where it starts to not make sense anymore. As a typical investor, or not typical investor, but watching sort of the curve of a crisis that we're walking through, when would a forward-looking market see the most amount of pain? I would strongly suggest that at the end of April, beginning of May is kind of right around the precipice, or you would, in theory, want to find a bottom sort of right before it gets the darkest, kind of thing like that. So in a globally pessimistic kind of world, I would suggest that around that time would probably be when it's darkest. That being said, who knows how many more trillions have been pumped into it before then, during then, what kind of crazy promises are where everyone gets twice double wage on government subsidy or whatever it is to kind of get through that period of time. And that's where things become a little bit funny money. Like that's where it's really hard to determine what's up and what's down in a place like that. So I mean, one of the other things I do like to actively talk about investing because I think it's interesting. I think investing
Yeah.
is one of those areas where it's an educated bet to a certain degree, but I mean, really
Yeah.
trying to figure out where things are going to go, where our market sector is going to go. Like you said, travel. What is that going to look like? Is that going to stay depressed for quite a period of time? Travel affects, energy and commodities and this kind of thing like that. I live in a center that's based in energy and commodities, so
Yeah, like
it's
what is it? Price of oil hit like $17 a barrel or something like that. Like Western Canadian
yeah,
Select must be at like, negative
less
five or
than a
something like
beer
that.
right now.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
very
pretty,
well
pretty, pretty
beer.
brutal. Yeah,
Yeah,
and see, this is the thing. Like that's part of, aside from the practicality of life. I'm glad I was in Maldives in December. Thank God for that because that was wonderful. Maybe I won't be able to go there for, quite a period of time. But then you go into the investing side, and it's like, all right, I think that cruise companies, in theory, over the long term, should be, a solid business. They're being decimated right now, and you might say, okay, great, over a period of time, they're going to come back, but maybe not for a long time if you're putting travel restrictions on people, right? Maybe it's like, well, this is not just a short-term bailout. And I think that's going to be this thing that's going to be super interesting, potentially a little bit scary, is if you say, hey, look, we can't do short-term bailouts because we have a long-term problem, or at least a midterm problem. And if you have a midterm problem, then a short-term bailout, money is going to exhaust itself. You're like, hey, we're still having huge losses here. We need another round of bailouts. And how long can you just keep bailing people out for? I feel like I should have been in a too big to fail business so that I could get a part of that bailout. To,
what's that line? If you have $1 million outstanding to the bank, that's your problem. If you have $100 million, that's the bank's problem.
yeah, yeah, something like that, right? I mean, and same thing here, I guess, with from the perspective of employment. It's like if you have to lay off, I don't know, whatever the number is, like 100 people, that's your problem. If you have to lay off 100,000 people, that's the government's problem, and
Yeah,
you can go and get a huge payout. So yeah, like it's very interesting, and I think like I would guess rationally that there is going to be enough political pressure that you kind of have to let some of these industries open up. You have to enable a certain amount of freedom of movement. You have to, especially like, I think that there's a certain worldview, and I like to kind of come back to worldviews and say like, okay, here's our model of how the world works because we can kind of refine that and therefore extrapolate consequences based on it. Is that I think that you can rely on politicians pretty consistently to do what's politically expedient. Especially right now we have an election year. There was no chance that they weren't going to pass a massive bailout package. It was impossible because all of them could have lost their jobs come November, right? So it's like that was not going to happen. It's like
yeah.
forget about whether their people were going to lose their jobs. The politicians might lose their jobs, and that was not expedient. So I feel like as you hit, or you may find that it extends into the summer, that they have some lockdowns, some restrictions, even if it's, hey, we don't allow foreigners in so much, etc. I could see that. But as you get to this near miss psychology, people are going to be like, why the hell are we keeping these closed for? Why do I have such a hassle traveling? This is a pain in the ass. And they're going to start applying pressure on government to open that up. And at the same time, there's going to be economic incentives to open up more. And that's going to come from industry and lobbying, et cetera. And that they would have to open things up and say, hey, look, let's resume pretty normal travel. I mean, look, the Spanish flu didn't, which was, arguably bigger and more impactful than this. Certainly we had much less ability to deal with it.
And they didn't have TikTok back then. Now it's all over TikTok. We're screwed.
I haven't tried TikTok. Have you tried TikTok?
No, I haven't tried it. I've seen a few people TikTok and show me. I might have even been in one inadvertently, kind of thing like that. But
I don't understand what the big deal of it is. Like, how is it any different from like Instagram stories or Snapchat or, like what's the
this,
deal here?
this will show. Like I'm oblivious to TikTok, so I'm by no means the authority. But by me, my statement that I will say and why I think TikTok works the way that it is, and I have no clue, is that TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, so there's no copyright infringement. So then people can voice over songs without facing fear of infringement. Is that a thing? I don't
Interesting,
know, but
interesting.
because I think on Instagram it always says I can't play this song because I live in Canada. In Canada, we haven't licensed the music yet. We're waiting for it to come to Canada. So every time somebody plays it on Instagram, that's what I see. Or YouTube, it's blocked because it's not allowed in my country. TikTok, everything.
I mean,
That's
I've heard
that's
Gary Vee say that the reason why TikTok is so picking up right now is because it's light. It's like more light and fun and less serious. Like, the truth is that if I look at Instagram, there's something very pretentious about kind of a lot of the underlying vibe of posts, right? There's a very fakeness of like trying to put out this image of like, you know, my life is great and look at where I am and this kind of thing. It's not universal, of course, but I do see that it's not very light, right? So if you say, hey, TikTok is like, we're being silly, we're being, it's doing some crazy weird stuff, some bizarre dance, and it's going viral, then like I can kind of see that, but I just don't see how that sustains itself. I don't see how that, is I don't know, got
I think
longevity
it's
and
because they get around copyright laws. But again, I don't know. Let's look it up. I'm
yeah.
sure Google search will tell us why TikTok is a big thing for the kids. But
I, I I think that guy has like a $16 billion net worth or something crazy like this, or the company has a $16 billion valuation or something now. Like, it's just insanity
yeah.
how quick it's taken off.
Speaking of exponentials, that'll be some of our next ones too. I'd love to hunt down some exponentials with you. Go digging in the weeds and the dirt and seeing if we can't find some companies in the troughs in the weeds right now that are that have great solutions for the world. I think it's kind of neat to see how we're integrating now with video. Like you said, I mean that's an old form of communication, video chat, and finding a different means of it, and that's
Well,
exploded into these kind of valuations. So that's something
man,
I'd love to do as a takeaway with you, Michael, because I think and with
yeah,
our community, it'd be really cool to go looking for those. So
yeah, it's super interesting. Maybe let's end on this, just in terms of exponentials, and it's not video, but what do you think about Beyond Meat? They've soared on their IPO. They've dropped down to below their pre-IPO price, but they're growing at over 200% a year. They have a valuation of about $4 billion. It's a food industry, so it's a really big industry. A lot of people can eat Beyond Meat. Uh, you know, do you think that they have a bright future? They have a lot of upside potential. Could it be, the Apple of, you know, 2020?
it's interesting. I like the perspective on it. I'm the worst person for that because in my life I've kind of grown up more or less a vegetarian. I do a
I know,
pesco.
I know. Yeah, I cooked you. I remember you were at my place one time, and I made some food with meat, and I remember your response. And now, you're a hardcore meat eater, so I'm so confused. I don't know what to think about life anymore.
I know. Even my diet confuses me or whatever. But whatever. Anyway, I grew up without eating red meat. I grew up in Vancouver. It was very regular over there. Every place is a vegan store and a salmon this and that kind of thing like that. And anyways, it was just very common.
You didn't eat
And
chicken though back then either.
I didn't. Basically, just probably fish, maybe a little bit of eggs or something like that. There, no
Yeah.
chicken until I got to be a little bit older. So I'd probably be about a foot taller if I did that math earlier. So you won that round, Michael.
Ah,
But yeah, no. So as I said, my particular perspective is a little bit jaded, where I just have zero cravings for red meat and this kind of thing like that. So I almost don't. I almost see it as a fad because I'm like, well, what the hell? You just grow up not eating red meat or something like that. But apparently, there's a lot of you that grew up eating red meat, so you like it. So I should probably understand what you need, and then make
well,
an investment choice. Just
so
right?
like So I don't remember if I've even tried Beyond Meat. Tiana has, because she's a pescatarian and she hasn't eaten, meat since she was like, I don't know, 16 or something like that. And she loved it. She thought it was great. But there's a difference between Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. These are kind of like two competing things. And I was looking actually at the pre-IPO of Impossible Foods, like, I don't know, a month or two ago. Uh, and we opted not to invest in it, which is, given what the market's done, probably a good idea. But basically, the contrast, as I understand it, is Beyond Meat is essentially plant-based alternatives to meat. So they make it taste like meat, but it's not meat. Impossible Foods, my understanding is they're doing synthetic meat. So they're basically growing it, in labs without, basically they can somehow grow animal protein without having to have harm to animals, which is kind of this ethical side. And interestingly, a really good friend of mine was commenting, he was quoting like the CEO or something, and the CEO was saying, he's like, you know what, we polled all these meat eaters, all these people who love eating meat, and not a single one of them said that killing an animal had something to do with why they liked to eat meat. And so we believe if we can remove that from the equation, we're going to pick up a big portion of business. I think that there's something to be fair for that. I certainly am happy not to kill some animals. If I can get the food without having some animal die, perfect. I'm happy to eat that all day long. And I mean, ecologically, there's lots of arguments that farming, like large scale raising cattle and things like this, is super harmful for the environment. It's damaging for the air. It's damaging for water systems. It's damaging for soil. Well, soil's maybe a little bit different, but so I can definitely see how that's a long-term thing. Like, I think if you were to fast forward 50 years, we probably won't raise animals very much anymore for food, because why would you? I mean, in theory, it's highly inefficient. And, if you could just do it in a lab, and you can get same thing, you could control the quality much better. You can probably reduce the energy input dramatically. And so why wouldn't you?
So one thing that I will say though about that is one of my good friends has like gone from, I don't know, zero overweight, nearly diabetic to I wouldn't a roommate friend of mine who I wouldn't touch his cupboard because it'd be sidekicks and Doritos and
Yeah,
everything that wasn't food in it, that kind of thing. Who's now involved into like, put him up against any like PhD nutritionalist any day of the week, kind of thing like that. And so, too many long road trips and this kind of thing like that as a conversation has influenced some of my brain over that. But even in some of my own readings now that I've kind of been like very skeptical of and now started to sort of analyze, fascinating how beef is kind of a superfood. Like, I mean, in terms of all the basic amino acids that you need, a
yeah,
high vitamin profile, it's a pretty super food. Like actually, when you look at like if somebody needs to survive on one thing alone, like
yeah,
kind of beef or whatever. And so one of the things that I need to do is a little bit more research to see, does this Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods or whatever, does it meet that? And the other flip side of all of that, throw that out, is like, how do people buy stuff? You know what I mean? Like, sometimes it doesn't matter if it's the most nutritionally dense, the perfect thing like that. If it tastes good and it's easy to buy and it's fairly affordable and stuff like that, I think that it could take off completely, and it would kind of turn
I,
the world. I guess my question.
and I think that's one of the interesting things where, like, Beyond Meat, as I recall, they had like the Beyond Meat
Oh,
sandwich
you're
at Tim
breaking up there,
Hortons.
Michael.
Oh, am I? Let me know when I'm back. Anyway, so
Yeah,
I'm back.
yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah.
It's funny because it comes onto my screen saying your internet connection is unstable when I'm coming back, not when I'm fading out. So I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, like they got contracts with like Tim Hortons to be there. So now all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, if Tim Hortons is distributing and if Wendy's is distributing and if, I don't know, Jack in the Box and Burger King and whoever else starts doing Beyond Meat burgers, which I think just from like a social pressure, modern trends, like there's that expression, right? Like a vegan, a CrossFitter, and whatever the other group is, walk into a room, which one tells you about their particular thing faster. It's just,
It's
they're very,
CrossFit. But anyways, that's a good one.
it's a very vocal group, right? So because of that, I think there's going to be strong societal pressure to have, the vegan alternatives at some of these companies. And so if, they're like I said, I just look at the growth numbers like over 200% growth in revenues annually,
Yeah.
which is pretty insane. And one of the things that I've noticed, and this kind of fits into our exponential conversation, is the market does not account for that rate of growth well at all. And the example will be, if you look at Facebook, Facebook IPO'd at about 100 times PE. Obviously, they dropped down from about $100 billion valuation to about 60 billion before they went off to, now they're close to half a trillion. And you could say, hey, what 100x multiple, they've priced in the future growth. That was certainly my argument at the time. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, you have to go 4x in order to get to a 25 PE. And, like that's pretty big growth. But in reality, Facebook's stock went up pretty aggressively, much faster than the market. You were pretty good buying, especially if you bought at, 60 billion valuation. It went up a lot. You see something similar with Nvidia, you see something similar with Amazon, you see something similar with Netflix. Like, these are companies that are priced at very high multiples. In theory, they're supposed to account for the growth. If you go by efficient markets, you should say, oh, this is efficient. But in reality, that's not the case. In reality, they radically outperform in terms of the rate of growth of the stock price. And so I look at Beyond Meat from that standpoint, and I'm just like, I don't see how a company growing at 200% a year possibly has that built into their stock price. Like, just the nature, the market is not a very efficient discounting mechanism in that sense. And so I just see a lot of possibility for, regardless of, do the sales catch up and the profits make sense? It wouldn't take much, like 4 billion market cap. What do you need to have in profit in order to justify that? In a fast growing company, you're going to get probably a pretty high multiple, at least 40x, something like that, right? Especially with zero interest rates and all this kind of stuff. So, okay, you need like 100 million in profit. It doesn't take long to get to 100 million in profit. And I think that regardless of that, if you just continue that trajectory for very long, the market's going to be going nuts and the stock price is going to be way ahead of that. So I'm pretty bullish on Beyond Meat. I don't know whether they're going to be for sure a good buy or not, but it's something that I've observed with respect to this exponential growth stuff.
I will do some research about that one, and next time I'll have something more to say. I've been feeling very similarly with that about Tesla in
Yeah.
their introduction and their well, I think about iPhone being released in China. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, I just think that that's the electric car. China keeps trying to rip off and make their own electric cars and stuff like that, but they keep buying Teslas because they like
Yeah.
them. They know that they're solid performance cars and that kind of thing like that. And you're growing, get in with the McDonald's when US went after World War II and that kind of thing, with one of the greatest increases of middle class development in the history of our world. And this is happening again with a factor of 3 in terms of population wise in China.
Yeah.
And so I just look at, which companies are able to orchestrate themselves well in, a demand share and be an innovative enough product where they can't be quite ripped off, very easily. I think Tesla keeps staying ahead of the game in terms of technology and automation for the cars, in terms of battery cell technology, in
Yeah.
terms of a factory that makes factories, kind of thing like that. Like a weird,
Yeah.
a weird thing like that. So that's kind of one of the ones that I'm also watching for the exponential growth. I think they've already hit a pretty good one, but I just think that they're sitting on so many things where, yeah, I was surprised that they've open sourced so many of their patents over the years because they don't really care about them. They just want to keep on innovating, so that by the time somebody copies their patent, they're already well ahead of where that
Yeah.
was. So there's some things there that are very challenging to replicate, and I think will do very well in an area like that. So that's kind of one of the ones that I'm also looking at. I was kind of considering, like, is it bad investment advice to like go and drop 60K or something like that on a Tesla stock? I'm like, somebody would probably tell me no, but I'm like, but if I drop 60K on a Tesla, I'd be like, great job, nice Tesla. I'm like,
I do tend to think that Tesla became particularly overpriced kind of late 2019. They hit, I think they're the most valuable car company in the world for a brief period of time there. And I kind of did take a forward looking projection. I was just like, no, you're not, I think, again, okay, the market is going to not do an amazing job of discounting at a certain point, but at a certain point, they do become overpriced. And I think the risk to reward, which obviously they pulled back a bunch from there. But yeah, I mean, I think Tesla's an amazing company. I would never bet against Elon. It's he's pretty impressive. But but I see Beyond Meat as being a more reasonably valued. One of the things, well, let's leave it for another time. We can discuss market caps and how they factor into investing decisions. Yeah, I think it's worth understanding these exponential curves, worth kind of figuring out what happens in terms of looking at, into the future. How do we understand them? And yeah, I think it's been an interesting conversation, Christopher.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And for our viewers over there, if you've stayed with us till this point in time, we've just scratched the surface. I feel like Michael and I are just getting started.
We'll probably talk for the next 3 hours after this recording, of course. But what can you say?
This is just the way that it goes. It gets warmed up, and once again, I feel like there's insight that's been transferred. I feel like I always get a little bit of a deeper knowledge and a different spin on things that I thought I've known. And yeah, no, just I always look forward to our next Michael and Christopher and Michael time when we get a chance to chat about the world and everything in between. So wish you and yours a very safe time in this turbulent time that we have right now. And yeah, to our viewers over there too, I hope that might spark some things where hopefully you wanted to jump in or have something to add, or yeah, might want to be a part of this solution building thing that we try to create over the next little while. So.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. Well, I will end this, and yeah, we'll continue on the next one.